Those who actually treat COVID patients are in the center. Not only have they shown extraordinary courage exposing themselves to the disease, they also have the greatest empathy for patients who experience the fear and loneliness of a COVID diagnosis. These are the medical practitioners, the heroes, that experts in the ivory towers and media have chosen to ignore and vilify. The experts far outside the circle of empathy have developed and supported the current NIH guideline of providing no treatment at all until patients are sick enough to require hospitalizations. As we are all aware, at that point, treatment is often too late. So here we are again, holding a second hearing to obtain and distribute information on what is known about early treatment of COVID. What could possibly be controversial about that? Yet some are calling this hearing dangerous. And instead of waiting until after the hearing to trash this information and our witnesses, the New York Times and other publications have already run preemptive attacks, implying this hearing is anti-vaccine. So let me be clear. This hearing, like the first hearing, is focused on early treatment of COVID. It is not about vaccines. End of story. In my opinion, discouraging and in some cases prohibiting the research and use of drugs that have been safely used for decades has cost tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people their lives. By the time any vaccine is fully deployed, no matter how successful, how effective, how safe, millions more will become infected. With effective early treatment, fewer people will get seriously ill and fewer people will die. So why not give early treatment a shot? What have we got to lose? And finally, why is there such a concerted effort to silence the voices of courageous health professionals promoting early treatment? It makes no sense.
This behavior damages the credibility of this committee and does nothing to advance the health and the safety of the American people. Sadly, it appears that today's hearing is going to follow the same path, playing politics with public health, and will not give us the information that we need to take on this crisis. The panelists have been selected for their political, not their medical views, and for that reason, the composition of the panel creates a false and terribly harmful impression of the scientific and medical consensus. Now, I certainly welcome diverse perspectives, but we have a responsibility to follow science, to follow facts, not conspiracy theories, and not disinformation.
Then I hope they actually listen to the witnesses and to their testimony and to the questions and answers and just really understand how far from reality the ranking member's opening statement truly was. And since I announced your presence at this hearing, I've heard from all kinds of patients what a fabulous doctor you are.
You're very kind.
Thank you for coming here. Thank you for being a doctor. Dr. Asqui.
Why then, with a disease we had never seen before in late March, are practicing physicians being condemned, ridiculed, or shamed in some cases for doing what practicing physicians have always done, using their professional skills and expertise to make the best practical, life-saving use of the existing scientific research? It would be wonderful if, last March, the FDA or the NIH or a few big drug companies could have announced an instant cure for a disease that had just been discovered. Or, of course, in that event, we would have all prescribed it. Easy peasy. But they didn't have it then, and they don't have it now. That's one reason why the FDA encourages the use of FDA-approved drugs approved for one disease to be responsibly and ethically used in the field for other ailments not yet researched or approved. In fact, that is how many cures or treatments get discovered. Drugs or treatments invented and tested for one disease or ailment are applied in a novel way or for an ailment or disease they have not yet been approved for or tested with. The health policy establishment's criticism of the frontline doctors was over the top, and it was unfounded.
I'm unfortunately unable to attend these hearings in person as I'm currently taking care of over 35 hospitalized patients. And it's an honor and privilege to stand here in front of the committee providing firsthand experience on the early treatment for COVID-19. Extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures. I could not stand idly by as I've seen more people die in these last 6 months than I've seen in my entire medical career combined. Based on in vitro data by Dr. Wagstaff, my team was able to develop and implement an ivermectin-based protocol that showed tremendous success in treating COVID-19. Early intervention increases the likelihood of keeping people out of the hospital and hence decreasing the pressure on the healthcare system.
And Dr. Corey, I have to tell you, I've had doctors come up to me and thank me for holding that hearing where they listened to you, change their thinking. They believe they've saved their patients' lives because of your testimony at that hearing. I hope your testimony will be as impactful today. Dr. Corey.
I just want to start out, I didn't think I'd have to say this, but I want to register my offense at the ranking member's opening statement. I was discredited as a politician. I am a physician and a man of science. I have done nothing but commit myself to scientific truth and the care of patients. And to hear that I'm here because of a political angle, I am not a politician, I'm a physician. I want to start out by saying that I'm not speaking as an individual, I'm speaking on behalf of the organization that I'm a part of. We are a group of some of the most highly published physicians in the world. We have near 2,000 peer-reviewed publications among us, led by Professor Paul Marik, who's our intellectual leader. We came together early on in the pandemic, and all we have sought is to review the world's literature on every facet of this disease, trying to develop effective protocols. You just mentioned that I was here in May, and I recommended that it was critical that we use corticosteroids in this disease when all of the national and international healthcare organizations said we cannot use those. That turned out to be a life-saving recommendation. I am here again today with a new recommendation. In the last 9 months, in our review of all of the literature as a group, again, we are some of the most highly published physicians in our specialty and the world. We have done nothing but try to figure out how to identify a repurposed and available drug to treat this illness. We have now come to the conclusion after 9 months, and I have to point out, I am severely troubled by the fact that the NIH, the FDA, and the CDC, I do not know of any task force that was assigned or compiled to review repurposed drugs in an attempt to treat this disease. Everything has been about novel and or expensive pharmaceutically engineered drugs, things like tocilizumab and remdesivir and monoclonal antibodies and vaccines. We have 100 years of medicine development. We know we are expert in all the medicines we use, and I do not know of a task force that has been focused on repurposed drugs. I will tell you that my group and our organization, I will say that we have filled that void. That is all we have done is focus on the things we know and things we do. And I'm here to tell you, Dr. Reiter, he just presented. He has one study of the many that I want to talk about. And I want to talk about that we have a solution to this crisis. There is a drug that is proving to be of miraculous impact. And when I say miracle, I do not use that term lightly. And I don't want to be sensationalized when I say that. That is a scientific recommendation based on mountains of data that has emerged in the last 3 months. When I am told, and I just had to hear this in the opening sentence, that we are touting things that are not FDA or NIH recommended, let me be clear. The NIH, their recommendation on ivermectin, which is to not use it outside of controlled trials, is from August 27th. We are now in December. This is 3 to 4 months later. Mountains of data have emerged from many centers and countries around the world showing the miraculous effectiveness of ivermectin. It basically obliterates transmission of this virus. If you take it, you will not get sick. It is proving to be an immensely powerful antiviral and anti-inflammatory agent. It is critical for its use in this disease. We, again, stand by our manuscript. It is a scientific manuscript. It's been submitted for peer review. But please recognize, peer review takes time. It takes months. We do not have months. We have 100,000 patients in the hospital right now dying. I'm a lung specialist. I'm an ICU specialist. I've cared for more dying COVID patients than anyone can imagine. They're dying because they can't breathe. They can't breathe. They're on high-flow oxygen delivery devices. They're on non-invasive ventilators, and or they're sedated and paralyzed and attached to mechanical ventilators that breathe for them. And I watch them every day. They die. By the time they get me in the ICU, they're already dying. They're almost impossible to recover. Early treatment is key. We need to offload the hospitals. We are tired. I can't keep doing this. If you look at my manuscript, and if I have to go back to work next week, any further deaths are going to be needless deaths, and I cannot be traumatized by that. I cannot keep caring for patients when I know that they could have been saved with earlier treatment, and that drug that will treat them and prevent the hospitalization is ivermectin. I am here today, I'm calling to action. The NIH, their last recommendation was August 27th. August 27th. I want to be clear. I am not here as a politician or a dramatist or sensationalizing what I'm recommending. I'm going to be very clear and very simple. All I ask is for the NIH to review our data that we've compiled of all of the emerging data. We have almost 30 studies. Everyone is reliably and reproducibly positive, showing the dramatic impacts of ivermectin. Please, I'm just asking that they review our manuscript. It is a serious manuscript by serious, highly experienced physicians and researchers. You know who's dying here? It's our African American and Latino and elderly. It's some of the most disadvantaged and impoverished members of our society. They are dying at higher rates than anyone else. It's the most severe discrepancy I've seen in my medical career. And we are responsible to protect those disadvantaged members. We have a special duty to provide countermeasures. The amount of evidence to show that ivermectin is life-saving and protective is so immense, and the drug is so safe. My colleagues have talked about it. It must be instituted and implemented. I'm asking the NIH to review our data and come up with recommendations for society. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank Dr. Corey, and I will make you this guarantee that before the day is out, we'll have a letter. First of all, we'll enter all your data into our hearing record, and then I'll have a letter to the NIH asking them to review it.
Please,
okay?
and
hopefully I'll have some senators join me in that.
And I never thought I would have to say this, but I am a lifelong Democrat with a subscription to the New York Times. And I have to say I was quite dismayed this morning and almost didn't participate when I saw the news that I was participating as a fringe member of an anti-vaxxer group. That couldn't be further from the truth. I read further down in the New York Times and saw that 202,000 new cases were presented yesterday in the U.S. And I'm confronted with the motto that accompanied me in over 17 years as a physician and scientist in the U.S. Army: one team, one fight, and mission first. We've got to get this right. I remain deeply concerned with our long-term viability to combat not only COVID-19, but other pandemics that inevitably will happen. We have to take a whole-of-government approach. The last 11 months have shown us what we can do when we do that. It's redefined what's possible for vaccine development. We may be on the precipice of new technologies that will absolutely inform how we develop vaccines in the future, but we are not done. Many are ready to say that we did it with vaccines and some effective treatments that have been noted to be quite expensive and useful in limited situations. But we're failing to adequately build a continuum of solutions, data-driven solutions for COVID-19 and the inevitable future pandemics. We need options now. If we fail to change our approach, we're going to be talking about this the next time there's an outbreak. It's going to happen. It's unfortunate, but we've got to utilize this pandemic to bring solutions to these patients right now.
We urge the committee to exercise your oversight functions over federal agencies that are effectively blocking treatment that could prevent 100,000 needless deaths and stop the crippling fear and the destruction of millions of livelihoods. What we need now is effective early treatment for COVID-19. Hydroxychloroquine and other safe, long-used agents, such as ivermectin, is showing particular promise, but there are others. They could be immediately available if the government stopped blocking access and deterring their use. Physicians need to do as they've always done. They need to respond to the needs of their patients, use the best available information, share that information, and continuously strive to do better.
So to me, the question is, before dismissing these treatments as effective because of lack of randomized evidence, I think the question we need to answer is, Why have there been so few randomized evaluations, especially large-scale ones, of these therapies? And for that answer, I'm going to put on my economist hat. For drugs and therapies on patent, a patent holder has a strong interest in running randomized evaluations, navigating the drug through the FDA's approval process. By contrast, for drugs and therapies with no patent holder, no one has much interest in funding expensive randomized trials or working assiduously to move the FDA regulatory process for rapid approval or even slow approval. The bottleneck then is not the FDA. It's the lack of a residual claimant for these drugs and treatment. Investigators working at academic medical centers may have a reputational interest in evaluating these drugs, and as we've seen, frontline doctors have an incentive to find good treatments for their patients, but they must find funds from somewhere for them, and pharmaceutical companies typically have no interest in it. In principle, the NIH exists to solve this market failure. It could and should use its resources to help fund randomized evaluations of these drugs for off-label purposes. The NIH's relative lack of interest in the rapid randomized evaluation of non-patented drug represents the government failure that has likely led to worse COVID-19 outcomes than we would have had otherwise. Thank you.
I'd like to begin by apologizing for the juvenile diatribe from the ranking member. Science is about having an open mind. Science is about disputation, debate, evidence, and it's discussed. And the contention and the back and forth is how we determine what the truth is. But if you close your mind completely to this and are not willing to listen, I think that's how science dies.
Paul, and I appreciate your introduction. I'm not here as a politician, I'm here as a treater. But the fact that we've had third world countries, second world countries that have been more innovative and have outperformed us in terms of survival, I think is something that warrants questioning. And it's one has to wonder if our bloated research academic bureaucracy has been more of a hindrance than a help during this healthcare crisis.
I almost can't describe what this data shows. People need to read the manuscript. We have 4 randomized controlled trials in prophylaxis, each and every one highly statistically significant. Patients or people, even citizens, healthy citizens on ivermectin do not get COVID.
And you're comparing it to placebo in these studies? You're considering it to this other
yes.
standard.
So in the prophylaxis studies alone, which is 4, they took COVID-19 patients who tested positive for COVID-19. They identified their household members. They gave them ivermectin. So they had a whole group of household contacts of COVID-19 patients who took ivermectin. The other households, they didn't give ivermectin. Every single randomized controlled trial shows that in the households that were on ivermectin, drastically reduced rates of transmission. The households did not get sick. You can protect people from this disease with ivermectin.
What we do know about ivermectin is that it literally destroys the virus in most people within 48 hours. So hence you take somebody who is asymptomatic, but a carrier with the risk of transmission, and you essentially stop that right in their tracks. My team currently has a study in place. We have the protocols written, ready to go. The only limiting factor was to get funding. I've tried everywhere. With the help of the NIH, CDC, or any one of those regulatory agencies, a study like that could be implemented within 30 days. Within another 30 days from that, we could have collected all the data. Within another 2-3 weeks from that, we should be able to have answers. If things are moved forward through the regulatory agencies, we can have our answers before this tragedy even worsens.
If we don't pool all of these data, we're going to see COVID-19 in our rearview mirror. We're going to quickly forget about it, and all of these potential treatments are going to fall by the wayside. So I agree with you. We need to gather the data. It will be large populations, but we have to make that commitment. The only way we can make these studies work is a true public-private partnership. So I ask the committee, those present and those who have decided not to ask questions, to just please internalize this message. We need a whole-of-government approach similar to what was done with vaccines to gather the data to do exactly what you said, which is get to these large populations to show a difference.
So can you speak to the challenges that maybe young people in particular, but all Americans face from lockdowns as a mitigation strategy?
I think lockdowns as a mitigation strategy are a failure of policy imagination, and they have had absolutely devastating effects. Humans are not meant to live in isolation, and that's the main focus of the lockdown strategies. The key failure, I think, is a failure of public health to recognize that there's dangers other than COVID. Heart disease, the psychological distress to young people is devastating. We basically made them feel guilty for doing normal young people things. I mean, and as a result, it's had, as you can see, 1 in 4 seriously considered suicide. That number is absolutely shocking. I mean, I think it should shock the imagination of everyone listening into thinking creatively about policy alternatives to lockdown. The lockdown should be a very, very last-ditch effort, not the thing that we decide is we should do all the time.
Even the WHO, I believe, has now said that mass lockdowns as a mitigation strategy they don't recommend them. I mean,
our group, every time we mention ivermectin, we've been put in Facebook jail. Currently, as of this moment, our Facebook page is shut down to the point where we cannot post anything. And we've asked the senator for help in that because we're trying to disseminate expert opinion, heavily researched insights into the therapeutics of this disease, and we are unable to do that on social media.
And what reason, Dr. Corey, what reason have they given, if any, for putting you in Facebook jail?
I don't know that we've gotten specific reasons, but the best that we can tell is that we were mentioning ivermectin. So any claims to a simple solution, and by the way, I'm going to stand by my professional reputation, my decades in medicine, and I'm going to tell you that I believe, not only I believe, but my group of doctors, and there's at least 9 of us who co-authored this manuscript, we are telling the world this is the solution to COVID-19 and it can be implemented rapidly. However, social media does not want to hear that from doctors. And I don't blame them, because otherwise you're going to have doctors coming along and saying, you know, I don't know, soda water, or this is the next solution. So I understand the intent. However, I just wish some credibility would be applied to us, and I don't know how to solve that answer, because I do think misinformation is a problem. It is a deep and significant problem in this pandemic. However, we are not propagators of misinformation.
Just to describe in human terms what happens to a COVID patient, I think it is one of the more heartbreaking aspects of the disease that, and quite honestly, it's one of the reasons I know people that will not get tested, because they don't want to become a COVID patient because they don't want to be separated from their family. But
it is very, very isolating for these people. We now know that besides all the medical problems that COVID causes, the kidney problems, the heart problem, the lung problems, we also know that it creates tremendous amount of problems with mental status. These people, their mind is not quite right. And we have seen this, a tremendous amount of anxiety. So yes, it has been emotionally draining, both for the patients, their families, and frankly, for healthcare workers as myself. You know, I have a young family, I have a young wife and children, and at the end of the day, I want to go home and be safe. And that's why I have become such a major proponent of early treatment, because with early treatment, I will not expose the healthcare workers, including myself and my staff, unnecessarily to these people now admitted to the hospital with more advanced disease. And that's why I feel it's so critical to have that early intervention, because we do know that treatment works much better earlier on than later on.
You just made a pretty convincing case from my standpoint of why we should concentrate on early treatments, because if we can, we avoid that type of human toll.
And that means the physician is working for the good of his patients, like it says in the Oath of Hippocrates, not for the good of the organization or society or the political party or the advancement of science, but each individual patient is the doctor's first priority. I'm learning about ivermectin here. The Arizona Medical Association, our county medical society, the AMA will say nothing about this. You ask about, well, what are doctors doing? And the answer is, well, nothing that's not recommended by the FDA. So for a patient to have an independent doctor who is not under quite so much severe restrictions on what he can do is extremely important. But if the doctor's afraid that he dare not do something that's even very safe, or that's even being clinically trialed, or has been reported in the literature, even if a long time ago, that he will lose his job, then he has every incentive to say, well, there's nothing more that I can do.
You know, I championed right to try, and you know, Dr. Ryder, you know, basically that's what you practiced in. I mean, you had a patient there, you had to do something with that patient, and the patient's son begged you to do something, and you did something. I think that is exactly your right. And we certainly are seeing a different type of medical establishment where we have fewer doctors practicing medicine and more associated with these hospitals where they follow protocols, which makes perfect sense. But in a pandemic, you have to think outside the box. You have to do other things.
There has to be a forcing function for change. And when under stress, I think they fall back on what they know, which is reviewing and approving drugs like cardiovascular drugs, which they can take more time with. So we have to move the regulators outside of their comfort zone, work with them to develop new policies, and I'm hopeful that you and your colleagues, with your hands on those levers, can force that policy and get them out of what they know, and start thinking a bit creatively in the middle of a pandemic.
Yeah, I'm a big supporter of allowing doctors to be doctors and allowing patients to make these decisions, because it's their lives or it's their families' lives. Some of these less developed countries that just don't have the type of money to throw it at a medical system like the U.S., all they have are these cheap generic drugs, are using them and doing quite well. Does anybody have some expertise to kind of speak to that?
There's good literature that suggests that zinc itself is very effective. I personally recommend to my patients that all of them take 50 milligrams of chelated zinc a day if they can tolerate the dyspepsia, and to keep their vitamin D levels over 30. There's significant data, a very nice study in the U.S., large study, as well as one out of Israel, that if one keeps one's vitamin D3 level over 30, that one cuts the relative risk of getting COVID by 50 to 55%. So Dr. Corey in his testimony mentioned that two groups in the United States have been hardest hit, African Americans and Hispanics. African Americans, 81% of African Americans in the United States suffer from vitamin D deficiency, 60% of Hispanics, 40% of Caucasians. Nursing home patients are notorious for being vitamin D deficient. Military service members also are known to be vitamin D deficient. You'd think they were sunning themselves on these aircraft carriers, but obviously quite the contrary. I think that we should follow the example of the National Health Service in the UK and Scotland, which is currently distributing vitamin D supplements to their elderly. They've been doing that for a couple weeks now. Why we are not pressing this simple point while we go over these other issues fails to meet my level of understanding.
Okay,
Senator,
well,
can I answer
go
your
ahead,
question?
Dr. Corey.
So you've said repeatedly, and you and I have a strong kinship on that approach, which is, does it hurt to try? So what are the risks of treatment with these agents? When you look at the mortality and morbidity of this disease, which is unparalleled, we are seeing countless deaths, and it's horrific the way they're dying. And you look at these safe and low-cost agents, it seems like a no-brainer that you should try it.
Panic has been part of the policy, has been part of the lockdown. I think has caused enormous harm. It's a violation of all that I've ever learned about standard public health practice, which is generally to reassure the public, provide good information, and seek to develop good treatments and preventative activities. Instead, we've just panicked the public on how civil and interesting this conversation has been. You've heard disagreement a little bit among us, but we've been talking about hypotheses on complicated issues, and I've learned from the panel. I think this kind of conversation ought to be the standard, instead of this sort of closed mind, like we heard from the ranking member, sort of a closed-minded decision that experts have decided what the truth is, and we just stop conversation.
My message today is that the recently emerging data has enough randomized controlled trial patients enrolled they exceed the recovery trial, which changed the face of treatment of COVID. If you look at the summation of all those trials, ivermectin has shown itself to be a highly effective preventative and early treatment agent. It needs to be immediately adopted systematically, nationally, and globally, period.
As a frontline provider, I've been treating COVID pretty much every single day since the onset. I've only had pretty much 7 days off since December 31st. Every other day has been taking care of these COVID patients in the hospital. This is heartbreaking. This is really difficult. Initially, we had to fight to get what I deemed appropriate treatment at the time. Now I have the endorsement of the medical staff at my facility who are using these medications. I have the endorsements of my colleagues who have seen the response of this medication. Ivermectin is effective. It's effective in early disease. It's effective in late disease. It's effective in prophylaxis. It's an oral medication. You do not need to monitor anything. There's hardly any interaction. You can use this medication in just about any condition, with the exception of people on warfarin. It is safe, inexpensive, widely available. Manufacturers are able to ramp up production of this if need be. Besides the US, it's something that could be implemented as a World Health Organization measure. We really need to attack this together, and we need to try to save as many people as we can, because I cannot continue to stand by and see hundreds upon hundreds of people die in hospitals, thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people dying across the country. This is not sustainable. And there are easy solutions, inexpensive solutions, and it's time for people to start taking a second look at it and finally believing that this data is real, that it works.
Lockdowns don't make scientific sense. I believe they go against the WHO's 2019 pandemic guidelines. And as we've seen, it has thrown tens of millions of Americans out of work and have devastated this economy. To further continue it, I think, does not make either military, scientific, or economic sense.
I think the root cause of our problem is just closed minds.
Yeah.
I mean, people always preach at me like, follow the science. I think I do. I've got a very open mind. I realize that the term settled science is a very unscientific term.
It is.
We practice medicine, we keep advancing it, but you only advance it if you have an open mind.
Senator,
Tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of people have lost their lives because we took the eye off the ball. We refused to look at the obvious and try and embrace what would have been the dream solution, something available, something cheap, something that would work. Why didn't we give it a shot? That to me is the question of this hearing.